Good evening and welcome to one of Australia's oldest buildings, once the surgeons' quarters of the infamous Rum Hospital and now the Mother Parliament of Australia. It's the oldest parliament in Australia, and one would say the most important, but not me. Before we begin this evening, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal of Eora, and I thank them for looking after country for thousands of years. I acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and I also welcome Aboriginal and Torres Strait people who may be watching this evening. Stan Grant Jr. reminds us that Australia is founded on 4 great traditions: Aboriginal histories and culture, Torres Strait Islander history and culture, British colonisation, and our rich migrant heritage. Now, I've had the pleasure of knowing Paul for many, many years as a colleague, a master teacher, a scholar, a curator, an author and speaker of great renown. He's a great friend of the Parliament and has spoken at a number of our events over the years. Now, tonight we're actually filming our event, so the photographer is at the back, so you're not going to be in the film, but it's so that we can make this available to the people across New South Wales after this evening. Now, any questions? Everyone okay to go? Perfect. So if I could introduce the Honourable Jonathan O'Dea, the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, and the member for Davidson to open our event tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan, and welcome all to Australia's oldest parliament. I too acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. But this evening's program, part of the House Talks series, is indeed part of the Parliament's push to increase its education and engagement with the public, and that's a really important priority. We've got this program as part of a series of virtual and live events that are organised by our communications, engagement and education team and our staff, and it features experts and special guests speaking on historical and cultural topics that relate to the history and the functions of the New South Wales Parliament and Legislature. I also particularly welcome you to this room. That's my favourite room in this Parliament. It's called the Jubilee Room. And indeed, the Jubilee Room was designed by government architect Walter Liberty Vernon, who also designed the Art Gallery of New South Wales, Admiralty House in Kirribilli and the Australian Museum. And this room was built to commemorate the 50th year, or the 50th anniversary of responsible government in New South Wales, which was granted in 1856. It served as the Parliamentary Library from 1906 to 1980, and it's now used for committee hearings, many public functions, and indeed occasions like tonight. All the volumes that you can see around the room are parliamentary Hansard records from the legislative chambers, and the binding colours of the books indicate, perhaps some of you would realise, the red and the green are synonymous with the red and green chambers, the green being the lower house where I sit. I preside over that house. We're sitting at the moment. And the Legislative Council, of course, is red from the British tradition. The stained glass window above you, just ask you to have a little look up if you haven't seen that beautiful creation, beautiful, fantastic feature of this room. You can see the head of Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. And emblazoned there are the words, "Knowledge is the mother of wisdom and virtue." And you can also see the floral emblems of the rose for England, the thistle for Scotland, and the clover for Ireland, harking back to the origins of our New South Wales colony. And so it's quite a fitting, that we have this room hosting our House Talks event tonight. And of course, as Megan mentioned, our special speaker this evening is Paul Brunton, Emeritus Curator, the State Library of New South Wales. Paul worked with the Mitchell Library's Australiana collections for 40 years from 1972 and was curator of manuscripts from 1986 to 2001, the senior curator from 2002 to 2012. He's published on archives administration and on various aspects of the Mitchell Library's collection, and he's also former president of the Australian Society of Archivists. Paul's created a number of exhibitions at the library, including Matthew Flinders, The Ultimate Voyage in 2001, Miles Franklin, A Brilliant Career 2004, both of which travelled nationally, and 100, which was celebrating the Mitchell Library's centenary in 2010. He's got various publications. I won't mention all of those, but he's very accomplished and indeed fittingly was awarded the Centenary of Federation Medal for services to libraries in 2003. 2012 he was awarded the Order of Australia Medal, again for services to Australian history through various curatorial positions at the Mitchell Library. In 2012 he was elected honorary member of the Australian New Zealand Association of Antiquarian Booksellers, and in 2013 elected as Honorary Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. So, as I said, very accomplished, very experienced, and we're very lucky to have Paul here this evening to share his thoughts, in particular on Henry Parkes and Saul Samuel, the duo who preserved Australia's colonial history. Over to you, Paul. Please welcome him.
Can everybody hear if I speak like this? Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for that introduction. I think I can assure you we won't be as rowdy as your normal congregation is, so you won't have any trouble with us. Now, tonight I want to shine a light on just a small area of two distinguished 19th century politicians, an area that's not given much prominence, but it is very important in the preservation of our history and the writing of our history. One, Henry Parkes, you will all know, everyone knows Henry Parkes. You won't so well know Saul Samuel. Henry Parkes was born 5 years before Saul Samuel, and Samuel died 6 years after Henry Parkes, so they were almost absolutely contemporaries. Now, you can't really sum up Henry Parkes in anything less than a few volumes, because he was so active in so many spheres. But suffice maybe if I say he was 5 times Premier, 3 times bankrupt, had 3 wives and 17 children. It'll be enough to say we probably won't see his like again. He was not born in Australia, he was born in England. This is a lovely portrait by a woman, which is why I chose it, because most of the portraits of Sir Henry are by men. This is by Mary Stoddart, and he's held in this Parliament, and I think it's in the foyer that you walked into. This portrait is also held by the Parliament, and that's by Julian Ashton in 1913. The earlier portrait was 1891. But Parkes had little formal education and trained as a bone and ivory turner, and came to Australia when he was 24 and set up shop in Hunter Street. And this is from Fowles, Sydney in 1848, which is a marvellous book published by Joseph Fowles, which shows all the streets of Sydney with line drawings of their what was on those streets. And you can see there on the top, on the left-hand side, Mr. Parkes, Fancy Wear Depot. That's where he was. And if you move right on to the end of that road, there's Skinner's Hotel. This is at the corner of Hunter and George Street. That hotel is still there. It's 1845. The rest of the streetscape has gone, but do have a look at it. It's it's a lovely building, looks exactly like that. Needs a bit of tender loving care at the moment, because when I looked at it the other day, its plaque outside is dirty and you can hardly see what it says, but it's a very fine colonial building. And so he came here at 24, set up shop in Hunter Street, and then ran the newspaper, The Empire, for some time, and then entered the last year of the Legislative Council in 1854, and then in 1856 he became a member of the first Legislative Assembly and stayed there for 37 years, during which, as I said, he was 5 times Premier. I suppose just take 2 things from his career, which are outstanding and would be outstanding in anyone's career, but to have 2 of them seems quite amazing. The Public Instruction Act of 1880, which made education free, secular and compulsory. The state also became involved in secondary education at that stage, and of course federation. Although he died in 1896, just before federation, he is always given the credit, quite rightly, for the driving force. His speech at Tenterfield in 1889 really got things going. He'd been in favour of a united Australia for 30 years, but that speech really got it going, and the organisation of the Federal Conference in 1891, which he could attend as a sort of, as a grand old man who got it all together. So one could go on about him, but I want to shine a light on him in Australian history. But I'll just read what Alfred Deakin actually said about him, our second Prime Minister, who knew him. Though he suffered from numerous pettinesses, spites and failings, he was in himself a large-brained, self-educated Titan whose natural field was found in Parliament and whose resources of character and intellect enabled him in his later years to overshadow all his contemporaries. That's about sums him up. Now, Australian history in the 19th century and even in the 1880s, 1870s, was not something that grabbed people. Sure, they liked the odd tale about bushrangers, but it was not something that people were interested in. It was also bitterly opposed by other people who, of course, had convict forebears and were terrified, literally terrified, that their ancestors would be revealed to the world as convicts. In fact, when the library next door opened, the Mitchell Library opened in 1910, the manuscript catalogue was a confidential document and remained so until the 1960s because of this fear of the convict taint, or convict stain as it was called. But Parkes certainly was interested in Australian history. And he had a significant achievement in this area in enabling the records to be made available and, in fact, in promoting it. And particularly, he became the champion of James Bondwick, who was also a contemporary of Parkes. Bondwick was a school teacher, he was a historian, he was an archivist, and he'd been promoting the idea of the need to house records in Australia for some time. He published over 60 publications, Bondwick, though they are known for breadth but no depth, I must say. And he was a member of the Geographical Society, the Anthropological Society, and he published textbooks such as this 1845 book, very rare, Geography for the Use of Australian Youth. And also he published the first 20 years of Australia, a history founded on official documents. Now, that was very important. He went to the official documents that he could find. And this was published in 1882. And while he was looking for these documents, he wrote that all these precious manuscripts were extracted in the writer's presence from a heap of rubbish and old documents laden with the undisturbed dust of many years. So that was actually of material he found in England, but the same was true of material in Australia. And for his Port Phillip settlement in 1883, he became aware of the vast quantities of untapped resources there were, particularly in England, relating to Australian history, because Australia, New South Wales, being a penal colony, being a British colony for so long, so much of the early history was in England and needed to be available to Australians. So Bondwick came up with an idea that he would transcribe these records in the Public Record Office in London, in the Colonial Office, and for the New South Wales government. Now, he tried this out in 1884, but had no success. Parkes was not in power at that time. So he bided his time and wrote again when Parkes was back in power as Colonial Secretary. And Parkes became his champion. And Bondwick wrote in 1887 to Parkes, "If only £50 order be given, I would only take letters bearing on the history to be had in the Public Record Office, the British Museum and Admiralty, carefully avoiding references to any names which may occasion uneasiness to descendants." So there it is again. He's making it very clear to Parkes that he'll be judicious and discreet. Bondwick was 70 years old when he wrote that letter. He was, in fact, going to do this work for another 15 years until he was 85. So Parkes appointed him straight away after he got that letter. He appointed him straight away. And originally it was to provide documents for what Parkes was going to establish was calling it the National Palace. Now, this was to be a centenary idea, 1888, centenary of the colony. And we think of Centennial Park as Parkes's great achievement in the centenary, but it wasn't Centennial Park at all that was his baby. He was more interested in his National Palace. The National Palace was to sit on the highest ground in Centennial Park, and it was to house, so this is quite extraordinary that he had this idea, it was to house historic records. It was to have a sculpture gallery. It was to have an art gallery of historic paintings. And it was to have a mausoleum for dead worthy Australians, all in one big building. And so he thought, well, Bondwick could get going in collecting some of these records that we need from Britain. Parkes told Parliament in June 1887, "We have sinned greatly in not taking care of everything that related to the origin, the early stages, and even the later stages of the progress of this country." Well, it was really quite far-seeing of Parkes that he would get onto this and want to do something about the records. Now, he believed the National Palace would be the real monument to the centenary, and it would be a building, quote, for the education of the soul of the citizenship, so that the ability to look at our past from the original records would be an education of our soul. Now, when he said that he was also going to have a mausoleum there, when he told Parliament he was going to have a mausoleum there, and as he said, the resting place of eminent persons who shall have been ordered a public funeral by both Houses of Parliament. There was some catcalling in the House that he was only getting a place ready for himself when he died. But in fact, he pointed out to Parliament that he had already chosen his plot at Falconbridge in the Blue Mountains, and indeed that is where he is buried. And if you're driving up the Blue Mountains, you can, on the left-hand side of the road, you can go and see Sir Henry's grave. So there was a competition to design this national palace, and it was to be splendid, absolutely splendid. For example, the winning entry by John... Oh, sorry, this is another one. This is just a frontispiece to Port Phillip settlement. So his books also went in for illustrations as well. This was the winning entry to be constructed in Centennial Park. John Kirkpatrick's winning entry, 1888. Now, it was to have a central portion which was to be called Phillip Hall, after Governor Phillip. And at one side, there was going to be where the archives would be, and that was to be called Carrington Institute, after the Governor, Lord Carrington, with whom he was great friends. And the other side would be the mausoleum. It was to be 73 metres high. The exterior was to be faced with granite, the interior with marble. The exterior dome was to be covered in copper, and the cupola was finished with columns of polished granite. So it was to be a huge undertaking. The second prize went to H.M. Robinson for this, a bit like the town hall but more flamboyant. And his own son, Varney Parkes, put in a sketch for the Phillip Hall. So as you can see, it was grandeur everywhere. And this is there were many other, but I just stop here. This was A.L. and G. Macready, another view of the palace. Now, there was a bit of ridicule on the part of people. Then the ridicule rather became apathy, and then there was a lack of money. So we didn't have these beautiful buildings. But Parkes had raised the consciousness of the need to preserve archives. And Bondwick had been sent overseas, paid by Parkes, to go and search out the records in the Public Record Office in London. He had a part-time assistant, and he did dispatch a vast quantity of these records in the 15 years, or copies of these records, in the 15 years that he did the transcribing. And he took the history up to 1830. And these things became known as the Bondwick transcripts. And they are now in the library, in the Mitchell Library. But they were used by historians for well into the 20th century, well into the second half of the 20th century, the prefix BT, Bondwick transcripts. It finally ceased in 1902. But in addition to these transcripts, it led to the publication of some of these transcripts, which was another direct benefit of Parkes employing Bondwick. And Frank Murcott Bladen was appointed to be the editor of what became the Historical Records of New South Wales. Absolutely unique. No other Australian state has anything like these, and no other British colony had anything like this. Historical Records of Australia, HRNSW. You'll see that in history books all the time, HRNSW with the page number. Bladen was made editor and worked on it till 1902, which is when Bondwick had stopped in London. He was a very accomplished man. He did far too much work. It was too much for him. After that, he became the principal librarian at the library next door, but had to retire, as all the books say, in 1912 for ill health. It was because he had a bit of a problem with the bottle at that stage, having been driven mad by all the work he had to do. Now, the Historical Records of New South Wales, which came out between 1892 and 1901, have in them together a third of Bondwick's transcripts. And this is only up to the year 1830. A third of them contain Bondwick's transcripts, and that amounts to 6,526 pages. So it was quite a feat. Now, not everyone in the colony was happy about this publication. And in fact, the Sydney Morning Herald had a go and said, "Why must we read a quantity of the dreariest public correspondence, all that is hardly the material for history? The whole thing has been conceived on an excessive scale, which neutralises the talent of the historian and exposes the community to ridicule. Besides, the disproportion of the work is melancholy. 4 solid tomes bring us only a few years on our way to New South Wales." He was just writing after the 4th volume had been published. "In 4 volumes, Theodore Mommsen has written the history of the Majesty of Rome." So not everyone was happy, but those books were just used and are still used by historians, HRNSW. And we can see a direct line in this back to Bondwick, of course, back to Parkes and his vision to have a place to store archives, and his vision to make the original documents available to everybody. In fact, he was still alive when the first few volumes of Historical Records was published, so I think he would have been very pleased to see that. That was followed during the war years, the First World War years, by Historical Records of Australia, which sort of duplicated some of the things and was a grand project to cover all states, but it never really got off the ground fully. So that is Henry Parkes's contribution to preserving our history, which I think is a jolly good one. And somehow he knew he should become Bondwick's champion, and just got on with it and made sure that he had the resources to do all this transcription. He complained that it was very cold in the Public Record Office and he couldn't do any work in December. And by this time he was 85 and he just went on, and his handwriting is beautiful. It's really nice. But he does leave out, of course, if there's any prominent people who might be offended, then that is left out. Now, that's the preservation of the records in England relating to Australia, which is very important. And now we come to Saul Samuel, who... there's the Historical Records of New South Wales. We now call it to Saul Samuel. This is a beautiful painting of him in 1887, which is in the Mitchell Library by John Vinter. He was responsible for saving the original archives and having them stored in Australia. He was a politician also at this Parliament. He served a number of terms as Treasurer, as Postmaster-General. He was Parkes's representative in the Legislative Council, and he also was the first Jewish person to become a Minister of the Crown. He was a member of the Royal Society of New South Wales and a member of the Academy of Arts. Now, in 1880, Parkes appointed him as Agent General for New South Wales. Another rather visionary move by Parkes. Parkes appointed him. He remained Agent General of New South Wales for 17 years till he retired. A really long period to be Agent General. Parkes knew what he was doing, really. He was a very good representative. He raised about £30 million in government loans for the colony, and he fostered assisted immigration. But his great work for us was the saving of the Sir Joseph Banks papers and having them placed in Australia. Now, we'll come to Banks in a moment. I'm sure he's well known to a lot of you. But the Banks papers at the time were in the possession, he looks a bit like little Lord Fauntleroy, but his name was Edward Knatchbull Hugesson, and he was raised to the peerage in 1880 as Lord Braben. He was a politician, but of no great chop there, a minor politician, but he did have two claims to fame. One was that his great aunt was Jane Austen, and he had a whole bunch of letters which came down to him from Jane Austen to her elder sister Cassandra. Now, if anyone knows about Jane Austen, you will know that these letters, her letters, are as rare as hen's teeth, and this great cash to her sister is a great find, and of course Braben was going to sell them off. But before he sold them off, he actually produced 2 volumes, and his biographer writes, at the close of 1884, he published these letters in 2 volumes with introductory and critical remarks, which were mainly notable for their diffuse irrelevance. Nonetheless, the letters were out. And his other great claim to fame, that another grandfather of his had married, another grandfather of his and Joseph Banks had married sisters. So as Banks had no children, he was a collateral descendant of Joseph Banks. This is Joseph Banks, painted by Joshua Reynolds in the National Portrait Gallery in London. I always go and pay my respects when I'm in London. And Joseph Banks, of course, was the botanist who went with Cook in 1770, recommended that the colony be established on the east coast of Australia in 1779 to the House of Commons Committee, and until his death in 1820 was involved in everything in New South Wales. He chose governors, he sent out explorers, he sent out botanists. He had a finger in every pie. And he lived at 32 Soho Square, London. The one at the top is what it was like in his time, in the corner, in the left corner. And the one below it was bombed in the war. And so this is a relatively new, well, not a new building, but post-war building, now run by 20th Century Fox. And there is a plaque there, just you can see it in red, outlined in red, at the bottom, to say that this was Joseph Banks' home. But that was where so many letters headed 32 Soho Square relating to Australia were written by him and written to him. And there was his library in that, in 32 Soho Square. Really, it was a magnificent thing, and it was open to the public, and people who wanted to use his collections could come in and do so. Now, he died in 1820, and like a lot of great men, his will was a complete mess. And he had the most organised library, as you can see there, of all the manuscripts, books, etc., that he had. The letters were sent to him, copies of letters that he sent. It was so good that if he were in London and he wanted something from his country estate in Lincolnshire, or vice versa, he only had to tell his steward which shelf it was on. And so everything was beautifully filed. By this stage, by the 1880s, was a complete mess. It had descended through the Knatchbull family, now Lord Brabourne, or Braben, and Lord Braben wanted money. So when he first looked into that, the whole collection was in the British Museum, the library of the British Museum, now the British Library. So Lord Braben went along to the British Library and said, by the way, these were only ever lent to you by my mother. I'm taking them back. And the British Library said, oh, all right, that seems to be the case. So he took it back. So now he wanted to sell them. So he offered to the British Library the whole papers for £250. It would have been a steal. And the British Library said, no, we don't want it at that price. Now, before he then proceeded to have a number of sales to sell them off. But before he could do that, our friend Saul Samuel swooped in and said, I want these for Australia, by which he meant New South Wales. And Samuel recognised what the value was. So he asked James Bondwick, who was, of course, in London, busily transcribing, have a look at them and set a price. The price was set for £375. Still a steal. And Samuel said, right, as long as the price includes any other material of Australian interest in the bank's papers that you haven't brought out. So Braben said, yes, that's all right, it would include that. And so the deal was done. Now, Saul Samuel was senior enough not to bother with consulting anyone in New South Wales, not the Premier or anyone really, and because speed was of the essence. He just sent a telegram to the Premier saying, send a cheque to £375 to Lord Braben, please. And so he secured this wonderful collection. He hadn't given all the Australian material, and after Lord Braben's death, as late as 1929, there was another big sale of Banks material, which included Australian material, but the library bought that at auction. So the library has really not complete, things keep coming up, but a really major part of Banks's Australian collection, and it's used, is probably one of the heavily used manuscripts in the library. He was also, Samuel was also on the lookout for anything. He bought other things for New South Wales too, but this is Banks's writing desk, which was given by Banks to his gardener and then descended to the gardener's descendants in the 1880s. And so Saul Samuel swooped there too and got that in 1888, and that is now in the library. Here is Banks again, now President of the Royal Society. This was actually a presentation to Banks by a Spanish scholar, and there he is in the seat, the President's seat in the Royal Society. Now, having got all these papers, there was a bit of a move afoot in 1904 to have a memorial to Banks. And it was decided that maybe a statue would be a good idea. Anyway, so they established a a committee in 1904, and by 1936, all the committee members were dead and they hadn't done anything. So, this is a typical story. So what happened was, at that stage, the government passed an Act of Parliament which they had money, but and so the money would go to the library, and the idea, it would form the Joseph Banks Memorial Fund, and it was for the publication of Banks's papers in a manner and fashion suitable and fitting to the memory and services of Sir Joseph Banks. Now, the library did publish a couple of books in the 1960s, early 1970s, one of which was the Endeavour Journal, edited by J.C. Beaglehole. But we had all this money in the early 90s still left over. And I decided that it would be a good idea to digitise all the Banks papers by using this money, because it says, in a manner and fashion suitable and fitting to the memory and services of Joseph Banks. And Banks was always interested in new technology, and I thought he'd love to be digitised. So it is digitised. You could just Google Banks papers and go onto it. It's had a bit of a facelift since the early 1990s because it was a bit clunky then, but it was the first digitisation project in the world that digitised a whole collection while maintaining the relationship of individual pieces to every other piece. And the person who did it was working on it for about 3 years. But I think it's a fantastic piece of work. And that comes from Saul Samuel sweeping in, not asking anyone, and saving these things for Australia. And I think my time's almost up, Megan. So tonight I just wanted to shine that light on an unknown part of both these people's histories and what they did, first of all, to create an interest in Australian history, and secondly, to save the documents and make them available for use. Thank you. Questions we can have. Oh, another slide that says question time.
Yes, I thought that was appropriate. What I love about Paul's presentations are the little side roads, the little intricate stories on the side. But I think I actually worked with Paul for a number of years over at the library, and I think what really kind of stuck in my mind was what Saul Samuel Parkes were doing in that time, trying to capture these really, really important pieces of evidence about, part of our history. Paul was actually doing that in the early 2000s, 2010 probably I started, and he of course purchased for New South Wales and Australia many of the iconic items still available today, and many of those are also have become digitised and made accessible to the public. He also travelled with me around New South Wales to talk to school children about our history, and that was amazing, truly amazing. So what I want to ask you now is, hit us with the questions, please.
I just to say that I was giving another lecture in the library this morning on another subject, and which was about the Prado manuscript of Torres' voyage through Torres Strait. And I did make the point that people have said I only ever talk about manuscripts that I actually purchased myself. The Prado manuscript was purchased in 1932, and while some people may think I was actually at the library in 1932, and I wasn't. So, any questions, please? Yes, sir.
Well, a couple of things. The nice bust of Saul Samuel around the corner.
Yes.
I'm going to see him in 3D.
Yes.
And on the Fowles drawing,
Mm.
you've got Henry's
Yes.
there, I believe that's where the tank stream came through. It's when you used to be able to walk down Hunter Street almost geographically where the shop
Yes.
was.
By my calculation, it would be just where the entrance to the Hunter connection is. If you're walking down Hunter Street, the left-hand side where you go down the Hunter connection to go into Wynyard, that's where Henry's shop would have been. Another one over here. Was there a question over here? No. Yes.
Two questions. The first complete map of Australia, which was done by Flinders, is that still here in the library, or is it touring the country at the moment?
No, the printed copy is in the library in Flinders Atlas, published in 1814. The original hand-drawn copy is in the Hydrographic Office in London, because there's a British government archive. It was a British expedition. But I did bring it out to Australia for the Flinders exhibition I did and toured it around the country. It's a magnificent thing, because on the hand-drawn thing he puts Australia or Terra Australis, and he was forced to reverse that to Terra Australis or Australia when it was printed.
So the next question is, do you have a lecture that you prepared about his time in Mauritius? Because I'm from Mauritius, I was very interested.
No, I don't have a lecture just on his period in Mauritius. It's a period that I suppose is would be a very good a topic. It's not spoken about much, but there is a lot of his letters from Mauritius to various people. He got himself into a bit of, including to Banks, because Banks was his great patron, and he writes to Banks, because he got the governor of Mauritius offside, Charles de Combe, and Banks used to write to everybody saying what a terrible man de Con was and everything. And he knew very well that de Con was censoring all the letters before, or his men were censoring all the letters before they let them go. And he wrote to Banks with this line, and Banks wrote back and said, "Oh, tone it down. How can you, how do you expect this man to get you off the island if you're slinging off at him every moment?" He said, "I can't do much to help you at the moment. There are other things going on, such as the Napoleonic Wars, that the ministers are rather busy at the moment, Flinders went into his, this is the greatest, injustice ever in the history of the human race. Banks was saying, tone it down. I think he was happy in Mauritius. I think he was. Yes. Another question? Was anyone? Yes. Have another crack.
Sure. Henry and Saul Samuel had another relationship, in as much as that Henry himself was an avid collector.
He was.
And there were items where, in the Parks papers, you'll see that Saul Samuel was writing back to Henry saying, "Can you please pay for those things I've ordered you?"
Yes, yes. Well, actually, the autograph collection that Henry had was not just signatures, it's the letters that go with them. If I wanted an example of almost any English person's, certainly, but any famous person's signature, almost certainly could find it in the Parks papers.
Napoleon was in one of the auction catalogues, Napoleon's signature.
Was it? Recently, yeah. Yeah, yes, yes. There was a federal minister who used to, I wouldn't be allowed to say this because we do have libel laws in Australia, but there was a federal minister, not currently, I hasten to add, not currently. There was, in the past, a federal minister who collected autographs too. But I think he cut them out of letters that had come in, but it's a hobby that a lot of people take on. Is there a question over there? Yes.
With that spirit of far-sighted preservation and acquisition, are there things you think we should be doing now to preserve the great events that are happening in modern times for someone giving a lecture in 100 years' time about the Great Plague of 20
Yeah, well, that's certain stuff ought to be collected, and I know the library was doing something on collecting material relating to the Great Plague, and particularly ephemeral material that, you know, might be given out on the street, or material at demonstrations and things. But I think there's always more that can be done in preserving material, and preserving digital material, of course, is always very difficult. When in doubt, print it out. But it is possible now to preserve a lot of digital material, as long as you can keep on updating it. So yes, I think that it's always a humble thing. Of people think, oh, that's not very important, or I'm not very important. I was always anxious to collect that sort of thing, because it's something that bypasses in history. You know, for social history, it's often bypassed. You don't have that. Someone was talking to me the other day about when she was away overseas studying. She used to write to her mother every week, as you did in those days, and there's no other way of contacting them. And the mother would write back, and how fascinating the letters are now for insight in what was happening in Australia. Well, that's the sort of material that I was always interested in collecting. In fact, there was a project we started that was called collecting the ephemera and documents of alternative lifestyle movements, and it was called the Rainbow Archives, and we built up a wonderful collection. And in fact, it was so interesting to look at it and think that a lot of the concerns today, environmental concerns and other concerns, were all concerns of the alternative movement back in the 1970s and 1960s. So anyway, not Four Corners, the 7:30 Report did a piece on this, and the next morning I got a phone call from a person who said, "I'm going to have you sacked collecting this hippie stuff. It's outrageous." But I wasn't sacked. So he really was very worked up that this kind of thing. The 7:30 Report did the whole thing, was say the portico of the library with the gorgeous columns and everything. What is a great institution like this doing, collecting hippie material? So it was interesting that people didn't think that material should be in a library. It shouldn't be collected. And so I'm always interested in that part of documentary record, because all the publicity goes to things that we might buy at auction for a lot of money, or big names, etc., which is right, that's good to publicise. But not often the thousands of other things that are collected, which actually are just as important for the historical record. No more? Good.
Well, one of the collection drives I remember from the library was the contents of one letterbox address in Sydney for a year. They just collected all the things that appeared in the letterbox, all the magazines and bits of paper. Junk mail, and that was a fabulous representation of that time. And of course we don't see as much of that anymore, do we? Especially if we do not put your junk mail in here. The other thing I'd just like to mention is Paul's referring a lot to this, amazing collection next door. But did you know that this Parliament has one of the oldest libraries in Australia? So it's probably around the same 1826 period.
So it's a bit later than that.
Bit later.
Not a public library.
No, it wasn't a public
Not
library.
open to the public.
No, but it does have some very significant early historical collection items. One of them is the muster book from the 1800, I think it is, yeah.
First edition, Darwin's Origin of Species.
There you go. So it is a significant collection somewhat under our feet here. And around the walls here, all of the Hansard records since the Parliament started and Hansard records from the British Parliament. So, you know, it's quite interesting. And this is also a public, public deposit library. So anything published in New South Wales comes here. So, yeah, it's been coming here for a very long time. Okay, so once again, thank you. Extraordinary depth of research and knowledge about, you know, what this fascinating thing that is Australia's history. It always breaks my heart a bit to realise that so much of our history is still kept in, you know, the Lord's Record Office or Admiralty House or any of those places in England and still are not here and accessible here, because Australia is great at making our history accessible, digitising it and getting it out there for our researchers and our students. So, Paul, thank you. Extraordinary. Just a pleasure to listen to you again. Thank you. Now, before you pack up and leave, we have many of these events during the year. Our next one it's the House Talk by Dr. Catherine Fisher, really fascinating person. And the talk is called Sound Citizens, Australia's Early Women Parliamentarians on Radio. So we're talking about the 20s up to the 50s. What was not available between the 20s and the 50s in Australia? TV, exactly. So how did people consume information, particularly in the bush? Radio. So this was the era of the empowerment of women. For the first time, they started to hear other women on the radio who were politicians, and they were talking about issues that were important to women in this state, in this country. So Catherine Fisher, May the 2nd, and it'll be a similar time. And if you haven't already done it, you need to sign up for our e-newsletter or our little note that goes around via email about our events. And we have filmed this one tonight, and it will be available on our website hopefully next week. So the other thing I wanted to say, just one more thing, sorry. You're the first live audience we've had in nearly a year. So the 24th of June last year, I started working from home. I came back last week, and we haven't had our events in here, and it's so great to see you. So thanks for coming out. Thank you.